I wanted to ask you as well, how did you go about keeping track of all the scholarly opinions?
First of all, I'm not trying to sound cocky, but the Lord's given me a good memory. I teach PhD courses without notes.
First method, good memory. Second method,
As I would go through, I have a notebook here on my right. I forgot about that. It's got little tiny sheets of paper, little tiny squares.
second method, tiny sheets of paper.
And thirdly, I would categorize them in notes.
Third method, categories and notes.
And fourthly, I remember a very good memory. It's just there.
Fourth method is also good memory. Perfect. Welcome to Paulogia,
Paulogia, that's the skeptical YouTuber who asked the question,
where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And today, we're venturing once again into the world of renowned resurrection scholar Gary Habermas.
Now, the world-renowned expert on the resurrection is my friend Dr. Gary Habermas. He has released 3 volumes of his magnum opus. Here's number 1 for those of you watching on YouTube. Oh, sorry, that's it. That's the second one. Here's the first one. And the third volume, which just came out very recently, is called On the Resurrection, Scholarly Perspectives.
Whose promotional tour for the third book of his 4-volume magnum opus has seemingly transformed into a reputation damage control tour due to a combination of his own unclear or unsubstantiated claims and a growing body of people pressing against them. We'll be serving some beef, some tea, some correction, some vindication, and even some substantive scholarly debate. But first we need some context and a reintroduction to one of the characters in the drama, one of Gary's acolytes, a gentleman named Dale, and a YouTube channel he calls Real Seekers.
All right, well, let's transition to the main guy, Paulogia himself. And the first thing, as you know, you've seen the video, so he and I have been kind of engaging back and forth.
Dale has been presented on my channel 3 times. The first in a video called This Resurrection Survey Wasn't What I Expected at All, where he played host to a scholar party.
I'm doing a special for Gary Habermas, a celebration show.
The second as a cautionary tale in a video called How Not to Defend the Resurrection Against Minimal Witnesses.
With me tonight is our friend from Real Seekers, Dale. How you doing tonight, bud?
And here's how Dale himself looks back on his own performance in that one.
Originally, I did sort of an ad hoc video on Paulogia, admittedly one where I didn't put a lot of time and effort into considering what his hypothesis was.
And the third time, he doesn't appear, but I made a verbal reference to his interactions with Ed Raby, the rabid atheist, in my most recent Gary Habermas video called Resurrection Scholar Doesn't Like My Fact-Checking. A YouTuber and former pastor called Rabid Atheist did a 3-part series covering my Volume 3 critique, and Gary's real-life friend, under the name Real Seeker, was actively in the live chat for those. And if you go to Ed's channel, you can see the two of them feuding for the past few months.
There has been going back and forth between Paulogia and also an atheist, the Rabid Atheist. I've sort of given up on the Rabid Atheist. I think he's sort of set in his mind that, yeah, me and Gary are liars. We're purposefully trying to deceive people, but there's still hope for Paulogia.
There's still hope for me.
And he's been engaging a little bit with Gary Habermas and his new books.
A little bit? A 16 video playlist over the past 5 years with more than 1.5 million views responding to his interviews and lectures, plus my 7 video playlist, blog article, and in-progress writing on the minimal witnesses hypothesis, which directly engages Gary's written work. He's even got a verse in my song.
He says, can you ask what Dr. Gary Habermas thinks about Paulogia's theory?
Paulogia either doesn't know the data, or he just wants to whisk it away by going, these are hallucinations.
So yeah, I've been engaging a little bit.
I kind of felt that he's been a bit unfair and nitpicky against Gary in his criticisms and taking him out of context, not being charitable and that sort of thing. But I know he's working on a video in November.
You're watching it now.
I hope I'm alive when that thing comes out.
And I hope that he treats Gary and I in charitability. Look, the video that I did with Gary responding to various skeptical objections, there were several scholars and skeptical laymen that we were responding to.
And that video of Dale and Gary is what has us gathered together today. To help everyone keep track, I'm calling that interview and this response Round 3. Round 1 was a multi-apologist release party to celebrate Gary's third volume and my initial fact-checking of those claims. Round 2 was Gary's multi-platform book publicity tour, where he faced questions about my fact-checking. And now we have Round 3, where Gary backtracks even further in the wake of pushback from Round 2.
So basically, today, though, I did want to bring you on because I think it's been important. I've seen a lot of skeptics and stuff. We're going to leave them unnamed, but they've been kind of responding and raising certain objections to your volume 3.
Yeah.
And I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of give the truth on this and respond to some of these things. So
That's the intro of Gary's video, where Dale is presented as the initiator. But that's not entirely congruent with how Dale would describe the origin of the conversation a few weeks later.
there were several scholars and skeptical laymen that we were responding to. And that was Gary's idea. I didn't pitch doing a show. I just wanted answers to some of the issues that had come up. And he said, well, hey, I want to help people if I can. So why don't we make this a show? You put together all the skeptical objections from the various skeptics out there, and I'll address them.
Now in rounds 1 and 2, I teased Gary for refusing to say my name, even when he's clearly responding to me.
Just out of curiosity, who was that critic that you had in mind there? So
I probably would rather not use the name on the air.
It's okay. You can say my name, Gary.
Say my name.
A trend that Gary felt the need to address.
These objections raised by various skeptics, again, we didn't mention anyone's name on purpose, but there were fans of mine, both Christian and non-Christians, who at least I think are sincere in wanting these answers. So,
Yeah, Dale, let me say at the end, just in case we get nailed on this one, why didn't you made the point? Why didn't we mention any of these skeptics by name? I mean, there's a number of reasons, but one is I'm not trying to call anybody out on the carpet. I'm not trying to say anybody's dumb. I didn't say that about anybody. I think I don't call if I call their name, they'll say I took them out of context. Whatever. You'll always have those arguments. You've done more research than that than I have. I don't know who the naysayers, let's call them. So as not to, at least my view, we did it because there's no need to call people out and act like we think they're entitled to their view.
Gary has certainly felt free to call me out before.
Paulogia explains this. He's gonna get it wrong.
So this is a new policy. And in what is going to be a running theme for this whole video, the apologists are going to entirely misunderstand or misrepresent the motivations and substance of my objections and the objections of other critics.
a lot of skeptics have kind of taken advantage of you have sort of a policy where you want to engage in certain types of skeptics, credible scholarly types, whereas you try to avoid mentioning, popularizers or dealing with popularizers.
Right.
I just wanted to get from you, they will take advantage of that and say, well, see, Gary's afraid of me. He can't refute my arguments.
Right.
I just want to hear from you. What is your thinking behind that policy?
Well, I'll say positive and negative. I've not seen anybody. You see more of these responses than I do, for sure. But I've not seen anybody say he's afraid of me.
I'm pretty sure I watched more of these responses than both of you. And I'll agree with Gary here that I've not seen anybody say that they are afraid of Gary. I did say I was sad about Gary's policy, my Bachelor of Commerce in Computer Science degree, and incomplete run towards a Bachelor of Theology do not add up to anything close to these credentials. So Gary will never have to address my minimal witnesses hypothesis directly, and that's fair enough. I can respect a clear methodology. You can't cover everything. But that's a far cry from accusing Gary of being scared of me, nor am I concerned with being called out by Gary.
It was his idea not to name names out of charity. He didn't want that video to come across as kind of an attack video or something. He just wanted it to be, look, here's the substantive objection. How do I respond to it?
Well, that's the problem. The audience can't evaluate Gary's response to the substantive objection if he's not citing the source for the objection. The audience just has to take Gary at his word that he's accurately conveying the objection. Without the citation, Gary may well be fighting a straw man of his own invention. The whole reason for his Volume 3 book to exist is allegedly to provide all the citations. But when it comes to being critical of the book, he thinks avoiding citations is the better policy. Avoiding saying the names undermines Gary's credibility. a point that interviewer Dale seemed to have acknowledged in a comment he left on a Rabid Atheist YouTube video.
Gary requested that we not mention anyone's names on the show, not just Paulogia, because he wanted to be respectful and get his answers out there without it looking like we were engaging in a tit-for-tat attack video against the skeptics we referenced. The motivations were respectful, not disrespectful. Now, as I was quoted in the video from one of my comments, I personally disagree with Gary's policy. I think it would be better to just drop the names, as there is no harm done by doing so, and only creates confusion and willful misrepresentation of him by doing so. But as a host, I respect my guests' wishes. I have done so in various ways over the years to accommodate a guest who makes a special request before coming on the show. This has nothing to do with cowardice on my part, as though I was too scared to say no to Gary or something, but instead I was accommodating a guest's wishes within reason, as any good host will do.
And in fact, this ambiguity has caused problems even in this conversation. In round 1, Gary was bragging about Volume 3 referencing more Christians than non-Christians, and I fact-checked him.
There are probably more non-Christians than Christians in the book.
Probably more non-Christians than Christians in the book? Now, 558 scholars is a lot of scholars, but it's not so many scholars that I can't go find out the self-proclaimed religions of each for those who have been public about such things. As far as I can determine, based on public record, Gary's got 2 agnostics, 4 ancient Greeks, presumably polytheistic, 12 atheists, 1 Buddhist, 4 deists, 14 Jews, and 1 self-proclaimed skeptic. 78 were unknown, undeclared, or just underdetermined. And that leaves 443 of Gary's scholars who self-identify as Christians. Because Gary didn't specify what kind of Christians he meant, I'm not going to split hairs on denominations. Even if all 78 of those unidentified were part of the Church of Satan, that still means 79% of the authors referenced in Gary's book are Christians. 92% of the identified authors are Christians. We will come back to the substance of this, but for now, let's look at how in round 2, Gary was characterizing who made the objection.
So you were telling me earlier that someone had told you that there are several skeptics out there who are asking or they're really pushing back on you in a specific manner.
In this volume.
Yeah, in this volume.
Yeah.
You know, you cite, was it close to 6 or over 500 different scholars? More than 500 different scholars. But most of those that you have listed in the index are Christians. I think like 350, you said, or about 350 of those 550 are Christians.
I have not counted the index names. Oh, I see what you're saying. You mean people who write in this book? Yeah, it's been reported to me so far that there's been 3 different skeptical scholars who have said something like this.
Gary said the claim came from 3 unnamed skeptical scholars, yet the numbers Mike used were clearly my numbers, and Gary does not consider me a scholar. So there's no way to tell if Gary knows full well he's talking about me, or if we can take him at his word that he's relaying an anonymized secondhand story. And I presciently speculated, and Gary's real-life friend, under the name Real Seeker, was actively in the live chat for those. So if I had to guess, that's probably where the report originated. And 2 YouTubers evolved through legendary development to 3 skeptical scholars. My guess was confirmed in the newest Dale-Gary interview.
Yeah, I think you told me one time, Dale, and this doesn't come from my account because I don't read or count these things, but you told me that a few scholars, I think you said 3, but a few, I'm not being specific, I didn't do the research.
And before that, confirmed by Dale in some YouTube comments.
One thing I clarify as it relates to me personally and what Paulogia said about me as Gary's source for the report about you and him as 3 skeptical scholars. Paulogia claimed that I either lied to Gary and or that Gary miscommunicated about this, when actually Gary was factually correct on this front. I was referring to 3 actual PhD scholars on this front, and so I wasn't addressing you or Paulogia there at all. Obviously, I referenced you guys to him elsewhere to respond to. Of course. Heck, I'm looking at a 2021 peer-reviewed paper that I sent to Gary with 2 of those 3 scholars right now.
Amazing. Great. Ed and his commentators naturally asked the reasonable follow-up question. Who are these scholars? So that we might read them for ourselves.
Now, as to the names of the 3 skeptical scholars, the reverse psychology trick was working on me for a moment. At first, I genuinely felt bad that you were taking our refusal to mention names in the show I did with Gary as a sign of disrespect. But after seeing the pathetic attempt to shame me into providing the names by assuming I'm a liar, unless and until I reveal them, I've decided I'm not going to do so now. Yep, consider me the name Nazi. No names for you. Next.
Nothing for you.
But Ed persisted.
So finally, I pry these 2 names out of Real Seeker's mind. He gives me Michael Alter and Slade as the 2 PhDs.
So Michael J. Alter and Darren M. Slade, even though Alter doesn't have a PhD. Here's their 2021 paper critiquing Gary, which matches the detail Dale mentioned in the comment. But the trouble is, Dr. Lycona asked Gary about objections about this just-released volume, not to scholars with a 4-year-old gripe.
There are several skeptics out there who are really pushing back on you in a specific manner.
In this volume.
Yeah, in this volume.
Yeah.
I even anticipated this kind of excuse. Obviously, I can't be certain there wasn't a group of PhD scholars who were independently spending a day poring over the declared faith of over 500 names in Gary's index, but his book came out on May 15th.
This came out, what, May?
May 15th.
And my video came out on May 27th, just 12 days later. I doubt anyone with actual credentials was also wasting their time on this. A 2021 paper can't be an objection to a May 2025 book. Now, somewhat coincidentally, Alter did an interview with History Valley on May 3rd, 2025, but that was still a few weeks before the book release, and Alter clearly refers to Volume 3 as a future event.
In Volume 3, if I understand correctly, he is just going to be presenting about 200 or 300 of select arguments from his 4,500 references. So he's choosing which ones he wants.
So in this interview, which is the most recent public resurrection comment from Alter, can't be the Volume 3 critique, and Dr. Slade hasn't published anything on the topic since the 2021 paper. So once again, we're back to square one of my May 27 critique of Volume 3 being the only Volume 3 critique on offer at the time that Gary could possibly have been referencing. And while we're on the topic of Alter being a scholar worthy of Gary's consideration, and me not being worthy of the same consideration, here's a little snippet from Alter's concluding remarks in his recent resurrection lecture.
Noble quotes. These are 3 quotes I want to think about. Paul Inns, Paulogia, said the following recently, and Paulogia has a great website. He is a detractor and he is blind. By the way, he is a former hardcore believer, and he chucked it all after years and years of research. What's more important today is Gary has only his own intuition, selection bias, and confirmation bias to tell us what the vast majority of scholars think about group appearances or any appearances at all. For that matter, because he insists he's done no head count.
So for 2 videos in a row now, the scholars who Gary is willing to consider are referencing my work in their own work. I am flattered. But let's set refusal to cite sources aside for now and focus on the actual claim and the methodological validity of my fact-checking. In round 1, Gary bragged and was marketing his book as a resource that contains more non-Christians than Christians.
And there are probably more skeptics, yes, agnostics, Christian writers, let's say Jewish New Testament scholars. There are probably more non-Christians than Christians in the book.
So we're talking individual scholars, more non-Christian scholars than Christian scholars. And later again,
I counted. By the way, I think there's close to 600 different authors in that book. These guys could be, and I counted them by name, and there's more atheists, agnostics, and other kinds of skeptics, or people who could be pretty conservative, but in a different religion. So they could be a conservative Jewish scholar who's not a Christian. So there could be a lot of Again, atheists, agnostics, skeptics, and non-Christian.
So he doubled down. Authors who are not a Christian versus authors who are a Christian. Gary says in this clip he counted them by name. So counting names was his methodology, which is the same methodology you heard me use in the clip earlier. In round 2, Gary didn't disagree with this methodology, or even my results. But
from what I recall from my own count, about 1/3 of all the people in the book are evangelicals. About 2/3 are not evangelicals. So what I meant was, I have way more people who would not call themselves evangelicals.
You can see my last video for all the problems with the evangelical backtrack, but it obviously didn't carry the day in Gary's circles, because in round 3, Gary decided that the whole methodology of counting human voices isn't what he meant after all, despite claiming doing his own name count during round 2.
Yeah, so, some skeptics have mentioned they just go by, a kind of a lazy, quick scan of the author index, and they say, oh, well, there's 443 Christians out of 558 authors in the index.
Easy, you call that easy?
I think we have different numbers here. I think by 558, you're probably talking individual scholars.
Right.
But what if one of these scholars has 10 sources, another one has 15? You started with how many actual scholars? Dale, I don't know the answer to that. I've never checked. I don't know how many scholars. Maybe it's, and you could say, well, what'd you say, 5 what? I've not counted.
558 is what some people have counted.
I couldn't have told you that, but that's individual people. I don't know how many.
Fair enough.
How many separate authors? I'm only talking about how many publications. Everybody thinks I'm the stat counter. I don't actually count that many. I estimate.
Yes, we are increasingly coming to believe you when you say that you just estimated numbers based on vibes rather than actually counting.
And I think that's fair. Not by just counting heads. That's kind of, to me, superficial, because that doesn't, if Crossan, I'm just making something up, if Crossan is cited 52 times, and my favorite evangelical is cited 15 times, I think that gives the upper hand to the non-evangelical. Oh, no. What are they going to do? Say, no, that's 1 point for each. That's just a silly comment.
Yeah.
First guy gets 52 comments and the second one gets 15.
To be clear, the original claim and all the subsequent double downs were about individuals. How many scholars? How many humans? These were your claims, Gary. The only reason anyone is talking about the count is because you've been advertising the count. If you'd have said nothing, no one would care. Few people actively quantify the proportion of food bits in their box of Lucky Charms. People know they get what they get. But if for some reason the fine folks down at General Mills started advertising a guarantee that there would be more marshmallows than oat pieces, well then customers are gonna start counting. That would be a self-inflicted wound. Gary has backtracked from mostly non-Christian scholars, which is an assertion about a number of people, down to mostly non-evangelical scholars, which is still an assertion about the number of people, now down to counting scholars is superficial and no one should do it. I feel like this change of topics is a concession that he is wrong about individual scholars, and I can leave it at that. What's the better way to do it now, Gary?
Because I've heard that from other people besides you, I went back and did a head count, if you can imagine. I don't know which one I did. I don't know if I did volume 1. No, sorry, this volume 3. I counted volume 3. And it was almost, the percentage points, I didn't convert the numbers to percentages, but of everybody who cited, about 3/4 of the citations were to non-evangelicals, and about 1/4 evangelicals. That's 3-1. I repeat, I actually went through and counted the names. And every so often I stopped. I did little stick figures so I wouldn't forget where I was.
And you did this for every chapter in the book, right?
I went through the entire book. 3-1, not evangelicals. So I think what I've said is true. Nobody has to believe me, but that's the way I did it.
It's interesting that you say no one has to believe you, because it does ring as suspicious. You don't remember which book you used, despite going over every page. You counted the names, but you don't remember the count. You didn't convert the numbers to a percentage, but you're sure it was 3-1, which is quite easy to convert to 75%. You used a visual of stick figures, but there's no photograph of the work in progress. And I'm guessing that once again, that this count will not be presented or published for anyone to check. But fine, let's try to recreate this. You may not have realized this, Gary, but your author index actually has a list of citations for each scholar, which a person can count. I came up with a total count of 5,882 author references. This seems reasonable since Gary himself, in this very interview, estimates between 5,000 and 6,000 such references.
5,000 is probably fair, but if somebody knew an objective number, they could say, oh, no, it's 5,759. Oh, well, thank you. I didn't know that. But I would take it up to 6,000.
So we're in the ballpark. And to Gary's earlier point, we can see that agnostic scholar Bart Ehrman is referenced 101 times, where Mennonite Philip Wiebe is referenced only twice. Recall that when I was counting Christian versus non-Christian scholars in round 1, we found that 79% of the authors were Christians. So I plugged in the number of references per scholar, and guess what? Out of the 5,882 references, 4,805 were from self-proclaimed Christians, or 81%. That's right, the numbers got slightly worse for Gary when considering the references. Bad news for Gary, because no resurrection skeptic is in the business of trying to tell self-proclaimed Christians that they're not Christians. But Gary is, for reasons I can't fathom. His definition of an evangelical during round 2 was far too vague to use as a scientific criteria. So maybe in round 3, he'll give me something I can work with.
So it's not how many names are in the book. There might be more evangelicals than non-evangelicals, but I counted them here, and there were 3 times as many people who don't want to be called evangelicals. As far as I know, and I know a good deal of them personally, I don't think they would want to be, but that's my judgment on who they were.
I see. So the criteria is, if someone called the scholar an evangelical, would they like it? Well, I'm afraid I don't know many of them personally, and many have passed, so that entirely subjective criteria is unavailable to me. Now, it so happens that when counting during round 1, I captured the scholar's denomination if it was readily available in the search. I attempted to classify the denominations as evangelical or non-evangelical, but the available information for many scholars was entirely underdeterminate for me to be comfortable. So I made 3 categories for evangelical: yes, no, and maybe. Unlike Gary, I'll put a link to my counting spreadsheet in the description for your critique. So, based on number of citations, here's what I got. 21% yes, 26% maybe, and 53% no. The good news for Gary is that if he'd stuck to his simple majority claim, he'd have been vindicated. At most, 47% of the references are evangelical. So I'm comfortable saying it's very slightly mostly non-evangelical. However, with his new boast of 3-to-1 non-evangelical, he needs pretty much no one in the maybe category to count as evangelical. That seems pretty implausible to me, but statistically possible. You know what? I'm just going to let Gary have this one. He can say that the references are 3-to-1 non-evangelical if he wants. At the end of the day, it's 81% Christian. Evangelical versus non-evangelical is a distinction without a difference in a resurrection debate. At the end of the day, this is a marketing statistic for a reference book, and actually just one big distraction from the actual reason anyone should be interested in Gary's books: his minimal facts case for the resurrection, and the reality that Volume 3 does nothing at all to help it, and is a huge disappointment to scholars of all stripes.
Let me ask you a question up front. You just brought something up. Do you see more on Volume 3 than you did on 1 or 2? Which to me are far more substantial in terms of data.
You know what? I do think that there's been more attacks on Volume 3.
Really?
Just because a lot of skeptics see this is kind of your main claim that they haven't had access to for a long time. Like, there's been the claims about, hey, I've surveyed all these scholars and stuff, but this is kind of, now it's out there published.
Once again, I am dumbfounded that Gary doesn't or won't understand the fundamental complaint. For this, we'll need to quickly review the nature of Gary's minimal facts argument for the resurrection of Jesus. Here's a very pretty interview from 2019.
I do a minimal facts argument, and I use basically 6 minimal facts. Well, the two criteria I use is that I won't use a fact that's not multiply evidenced from a bunch of different sources. And secondly, because of that, the vast majority of scholars in the 90-something percentile allow its historicity.
So 2 criteria for a minimal fact: multiply evidenced, and vast majority of scholars agree, 90-something percent. Or is it?
Another main thing that came up that I've seen some skeptics going on about is this criterion. And you do indeed mention this yourself in volume 1 of your book, where it's there, where you have this 90-something percentile threshold, right? For you to, as the scholarly consensus criterion of being a minimal fact.
From volume 1 of your book.
An oft-asked question relates to my repeated references that the vast majority of scholars, or virtually all of these experts, agree with this or that conclusion. Can these phrases be identified in more precise terms? In some contexts, I have already been more specific, at least when referencing the shorter list of minimal historical facts. I most frequently think in terms of a 90-something percentile head count.
So
right.
I just wanted to kind of throw it open to you. Is this something you've apparently contradicted yourself on? What did you mean by the 90-something percentile? And how did you go about determining whether a fact met this threshold or not?
I only know of one place I've done that. Now, there might be another one or two that you mentioned, but I only know off the top of my head, I only know one case.
From Gary's 2012 peer-reviewed paper called The Minimal Facts Approach to the Resurrection of Jesus, the role of methodology is a crucial component in establishing historicity.
Regarding my references to the vast majority or virtually all scholars who agree, is it possible to identify these phrases in more precise terms? In some contexts, I have identified these expressions more specifically. At least when referencing the most important historical occurrences, I frequently think in terms of a 90-something percentile head count. No doubt this is one of the reasons why the concept has gained some attention. And there's a difference between prescriptive and descriptive. And I'm frequently asked in interviews, I'm not asking you, did you set up a criterion? I'm asking you, where do you think the scholars that you've cited line up? And I'll say, oh, they could well be over 90. But that's descriptive. I don't say anywhere in print that I know of, I don't say I only take the 90% who concede this fact or that fact. Like the keyword only or something like that. No, I'll say things like, I don't count those where they're at when I say a high majority, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were over 90. That's descriptive. Prescriptive would be, you got to be this high to be in the study. And that I don't think.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever said that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I have heard myself a couple interviews where you do mention this 90, but you never give it in a prescriptive sense, like, unless 90% or more scholars believe it, I won't accept it. You've never said it in those prescriptive terms.
Yeah. Once again, both Gary and Dale are completely oblivious to what the minimal fact skeptics care about. Gary has 2 criteria for a minimal fact.
The first one is, I will use no historical fact that is not attested by many different evidences. The second point is that because these facts are so well accredited, virtually every scholar there is will admit them.
Gary has spent his career, and indeed the first volume of his 4-volume magnum opus book series, on the first criteria. The first volume is even called Evidences. The problem is, Gary has been at this for decades and has never provided the data on the second point, on demonstrating that virtually every scholar will admit them. Whether Gary chooses to define virtually every scholar in terms of a percentage or any other metric is up to Gary. Whether Gary chooses to have a uniform metric for each fact or be flexible on a fact-by-fact basis is also up to Gary. No one is attempting to impose rules on Gary. All that anyone wants is for Gary to show his work. It makes no difference whatsoever whether the percentage of consensus, whatever number that is a prescriptive number, i.e., that Gary excludes or includes facts based on that math, or merely a post hoc descriptive number, i.e., Gary is describing his observation after the fact. Doesn't matter at all if it's prescriptive or descriptive. No one cares. The point is that you've claimed to be doing the scholarly work where you have two criteria, and one of the criteria is consensus, and for decades, you've been asking everyone to just take you at your word. Trust me, bro, is not how scholarship is done, and Gary puts himself forth as doing scholarly work. Gary felt confident enough to put in writing in his book that his descriptive number is 90%. So it is entirely reasonable for everyone to ask to see the math. That it's not prescriptive doesn't absolve you from showing the math, because you've made it clear that some level of confidence is prescriptive to become a fact. No one's going to force you to retract your life work if the math ends up being 85 or 80 or whatever it is. Just show us the math you've said you were doing. Or maybe you'd like to hear the complaint from people you consider to be scholars.
The problem is with Gary is that he often, and so does Mike Lacone and several other individuals, they talk about scholarly consensus, but they never show their data. It's one thing to say that the scholarly consensus supports the resurrection, but you have to have data. You will often hear, especially on the podcast, he keeps referring to what is called scholarly consensus. My argument, the argument of several other individuals, is that he never shows his data. Once again, I'll be very clear about this. Gary does not present his data. He just talks about scholarly consensus or words to that effect, as does Mike Lacone and other individuals. But as the old saying goes, where's the beef? You have to have data supporting your position. I want to know, where is the beef with Gary? You have to show the data. I have given a good faith effort with English language books. He has research assistants. He could have published something over the last 25 years. Remember, he started with 1,400 back in 2004. But we need some type of data. In volume 3, if I understand correctly, he is just going to be presenting about 200 or 300 of select arguments from his 4,500 references.
Remember that this interview was prior to Volume 3, and note how Alter, who has been following Habermas for longer than I have, was also under the false impression that Volume 3 was going to be Gary bringing receipts for his minimal fact consensus claims. Intentional or not, Gary was setting this expectation.
You have no way of knowing, and I don't think this is true, that Gary invented the number 90%. Where is his data that 90% of individuals support the minimal facts? And I want to know specifically, who are these individuals? What is their degree, if it's a terminal degree? Where do they teach at? Where do they work at? I want to know, what is their faith? What are their credentials? I don't know. You don't know. Gary never presents any data. He just says 90% or more believe in the minimal facts. That is not acceptable.
Even Christians have concerns.
I'm going to be talking about a different layer, which concerns whether Dr. Habermas has actually documented the percentages that he has claimed, and even what he meant by these claims, where he's claimed that this, extremely high percent of scholars grants this. Did he actually even document that? Because we've been taking his word for it on a lot of this, and one problem with that is if he's bad at interpreting, but another problem is that now he has said he didn't even do a head count.
Yes, this is maximal data resurrection advocate Lydia McGrew. Sometimes
the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Something else that we know, Habermas has definitely very strongly implied in what he has written that these percentages were not mere guesses, but were based upon rigorous research. He has even used the word head count. You heard, I just read, even used the word head count, as in the last quote, and he's used words like counts and tallies in other quotes. And volume 1 also has this: The research notes themselves are anticipated to be published in Volume 3 of this work as they chart the views of major critical scholars, reaching close to 1,500 manuscript pages and covering 140 separate categories or questions regarding the last days of Jesus' life. So again, he's implying that these research notes are going to show this to have been rigorous. Going back to 2012.
Yet another person who was given false expectations about what Gary's Volume 3 would be.
And Volume 3 seems to indicate that we're not going to get them. All right? Volume 3 is a list of, this scholar said this scholar said this scholar said this. And there are issues with some of the interpretations, but it never claims to be laying out, M out of N of all scholars and X out of Y of all skeptical scholars acknowledge this proposition. It's a very disappointing comment to those who were looking forward to Volume 3 with the expectation that, here we're finally going to get all that data that's going to show us how he's deriving these head counts. It's not there. Now, I have a suggestion about what I think might have happened. I'm not going to claim this is something we can know. This is a suggestion. But I'm trying to explain this data. I think perhaps Dr. Habermas substituted in his own mind reading and summarizing a very large number of articles and then getting a strong impression from all of that work of reading and, by his own lights, accurately summarizing those articles. He substituted that in his own mind for making a head count in the sense of, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, count them up, all right, and continuing to do so. Now, to be clear, given what I have recently discovered about major problems with his interpretations, even if I did have such a chart, I'm not just going to accept that, especially on items of special interest, without chasing down the publications and drawing my own conclusions, because I found so many problems with his interpretations. But we don't even have that, and I'm thinking maybe he's now correct to say that he didn't do some kind of comprehensive head count.
What do you think of Lydia's hypothesis, Gary? That rather than having the head count you've been promising for decades, that instead you've gone down a slippery slope and are now just giving your opinion off the top of your head.
The only careful count that I did, and even that was just on the spot. I didn't do anything MA or PhD thesis wise, but the only one I counted, instead of just giving my opinion off the top of my head on the guys who I've worked with, the only one is Empty Tomb, and that's in Volume 1.
Empty Tomb is not a minimal fact, so that count doesn't matter. And the rest, to quote your own phrasing, was just giving your opinion off the top of your head. You do see why this distraction of prescriptive versus descriptive acceptance levels is entirely irrelevant to this question of, did you do the scholarship that can be peer-reviewed, or are you just peddling vibes? In my humble opinion, this is the death of the artifice of scholarly rigor surrounding the minimal facts argumentation and its second criteria. The whole endeavor is
just giving my opinion off the top of my head.
One thing that has come out of this is that Dale has introduced me to the counter-resurrection work of Michael Alter. I spend almost all my time reading pro-resurrection work, so I actually missed something obvious about Gary's second fact, that Jesus died by crucifixion.
They take the crucifixion of Jesus absolutely for granted because you can argue it's the best established fact in the ancient world.
So I made a promise earlier. I said that in one word, I can defeat the minimal facts. And it's based upon the second criteria. So what is the one word? With the addition of Arabic, the percentage of scholars accepting the empty tomb would be far less than 75%, or the resurrection. Habermas has fixed the deck with a biased sample by eliminating all books and articles written in Arabic representing Muslim views.
It's true. Gary includes no Arabic material in his consideration.
When you see where scholars are, and I've pretty much surveyed everything written on the resurrection, French, German, and English from 1975 to date.
And by the way, that's another way to go after the count. There's almost nobody who took the swoon theory. Virtually nobody. Not in the study I did for the journal.
Not in English, no, but in Arabic.
Their books and articles being numbered in hundreds and thousands. Islam rejects the notion that died on the cross. That's Surah 157, because they believe that Jesus indicated he would not die in the Christian Bible. So in one word, once again, we can defeat the minimal facts approach. The word is Arabic. Gary, I'm sure, does not include any Arabic journals or books on the resurrection. I'm sure he doesn't know Arabic, neither do I. It's a logical argument. So once again, the minimal facts, 9% approval rate is a fake argument. There is no data. So when Gary says 9%, he's using a biased sample, and that's what Richard Carrier talks about, and so do other individuals. It is disingenuous when we hear on podcasts, interviews, or in books this phrase, scholarly consensus. Because who is writing all of the books? Who is writing all of the journal articles?
This is a great point. If a minimal fact needed global acceptance, the crucifixion one might barely cross the 50% mark. This is just an interesting aside, as I think that if one grants that Jesus lived, that it's entirely mundane to grant that he also died. I do credit Dale for asking about my continuing frustration with Gary Habermas's bizarre-to-me interpretation of Galatians as support for his resurrection case, for which I enlisted Dr. Bart Ehrman.
Bart Ehrman has come out and said, no, Gary totally misquoted me. He got me wrong. I never said that. It was always he went there just to confirm his mission to the Gentiles and stuff. So in the first way, I just want you to kind of address that. Is that true?
For the full discussion about Gary's abuse of this passage, see my Resurrection Scholar Doesn't Like My Fact-Checking video. It's been going on for years, but here's some quick context. Resurrection apologists in particular always present Galatians 1-2 as if it's their friend. When they read it, they see Paul making a pilgrimage to learn all about Jesus from the eyewitnesses. They all told stories and laughed and hugged and left on the same page. But when I read these chapters, I see nothing but hostility between Paul and the men who knew Jesus. Our interpretations are so vastly different, I was starting to feel gaslit.
He makes me feel like I'm the crazy one.
Despite reassurances from Bart Ehrman that I'm seeing things correctly.
In my judgment, he did not go to consult with Peter about the historical Jesus. He went there because he wanted apostolic support for his mission to the Gentiles. Peter was the head of the church in Jerusalem. Paul was converting Gentiles and telling them they didn't have to become Jewish. He knew that there were other people, especially the leadership in Jerusalem, that disagreed with him, and he went in order to work that out with them so that they would support his mission. And so it wasn't about finding information about Jesus. So that's the first thing. I don't think he was sitting there taking notes from Peter about it.
Gary?
Yes, I will agree with them on this. Paul went there, and in chapter 2, where he goes back a second time, in verse 9, 2:9, they give he and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. I take it today that means like laying hands on a missionary in the front of a church, But they commissioned them to take the gospel to the Gentiles while Peter and James took the gospel to the Jews. That was a big step in the early church. But I don't disagree with what Bart's saying. He was looking for enough agreement that they could all serve together, and Paul's slightly different message.
I don't disagree with what Bart is saying. This may not seem like a huge concession, but I take this as a huge concession. I've listened to more hours of Gary than any human should, and this is the first time he's even acknowledging the interpretation of the book that you find in almost any other commentary, or anyone who just reads Galatians without the resurrection apologetics priming.
Yeah, but don't miss the forest for the trees. If you're going to give somebody the gospel, which Paul specifically says in chapter 1 and chapter 2, in fact, what's the whole theme of the book of Galatians? The whole theme is, here's the gospel, get it right. If you get it wrong, you're anathema. I don't care if you're an angel. I don't care if you're a human being. You get this wrong, and you're going to be judged for it. That's Galatians.
That's an overly Gnostic interpretation of Galatians. Paul's warning isn't against wrongthink. The core issue is whether Gentile believers must follow the Jewish Torah to be saved. In Galatians, it is explicitly those who insist upon works of the law rather than faith in God who are the ones with the wrong gospel. Paul's ministry is explicitly to bring law-free salvation to Gentiles. No other doctrines are in play here.
And sure, he went there to have his ministry. I tell everybody when I'm doing my timeline argument on the resurrection, I'll say in Galatians 2:2, Paul said, I went back up later to set before them the gospel I was giving, to see if I was running or had run in vain. Okay, what's the gospel? Well, let's let Paul tell us what the gospel is. And, for example, 1 Corinthians 15, the best-known early creedal passage.
Christians rightfully complain when skeptics take passages out of context. Gary's question about Galatians 2 is, okay, what's the gospel? Then Gary wants to find the answer in a different passage in 1 Corinthians. But Paul tells us in the same chapter of Galatians what he means by gospel in this context. At the start of the chapter, we have the gospel I preached among the Gentiles in the same breath as circumcision concerns. In verses 4 and 5, Paul says freedom-hating Christian spies have infiltrated his group, but he's not going to give in to them for the sake of the gospel. These spies also affirmed resurrection, so the gospel they were there to stop obviously wasn't in the resurrection details. In verse 14, they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel. This is referring to Jews restricting Gentiles. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? The truth of the gospel is not resurrection here. The next section, chapter 3, Paul is still talking about the gospel as it was announced in advance to Abraham. Old Testament Abraham didn't know about resurrection, so that can't be what Paul is talking about. He's explicit about what he means so no one has to wonder. So those who rely on faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. Whatever is being discussed in other letters to other people, Paul is very clear in Galatians about what he's talking about in Galatians.
Yeah, he wanted to be approved of them in his ministry of the gospel. He used that word over and over.
That's true. And in Galatians, without exception, it's talking about freedom from law, not resurrection.
What's the gospel? It's the deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. Paul says it over and over. Romans 10:9 is another creed.
Gary's now jumping from Corinthians to Romans to find a definition of what Paul meant in Galatians. In hermeneutics, there's a principle of the priority of local context over remote context. Each letter from Paul has a different audience, a different purpose, a different rhetorical situation, and different vocabulary use. In importing gospel definitions from other passages to bolster his resurrection case, Gary is making a mistake that would have earned me a failing grade in first-year Bible college.
Paul, in order to recognize him as bringing the gospel to the Gentiles, you have to know what the gospel is. And the gospel in those two texts, 1 Corinthians 5, Romans 10:9, I don't think anybody, virtually nobody would disagree with this. The gospel involves the resurrection. Paul says without the resurrection, there's no gospel.
In a different letter, in a different context, to different people who are facing entirely different issues. Let Galatians interpret Galatians.
So I'm not saying he wasn't looking for their blessing on his ministry, but if you're going to bless his presentation of the gospel, you got to bless his presentation of the resurrection. And if he says, well, Gary just says it too often that way, that's because it's in the middle of a lecture on the resurrection. And while I say what I just said, that he was giving the gospel message, my lectures on the resurrection, I'm going to emphasize that.
It's not that you say it too often that way, though I'll admit it does drive me crazy that you say it so often, and apologists just let you get away with it. No, it's that you're doing hermeneutics wrong. I would have been every bit as upset about this as a Christian. Cross-referencing Romans or Galatians is legitimate only if the local context is silent or unclear. But here, the local context could not be more clear.
Well, I don't have a verse that says you ask him about the resurrection.
I suspect I'll be using that soundbite for future videos for years. Thank you, Gary, for finally admitting out loud that you don't have a verse that says that Paul asked them about the resurrection.
But I'm just saying, do you think Paul specifically asked about that when he went to Jerusalem? Because you were saying he inquired about the gospel. Would you say he also asked about that?
If I were those guys, I would say, I couldn't see them. This is my view.
This is my view means that Gary is leaving the world of evidence and entering the world of his own imagination and intuition.
I couldn't see them doing this without giving him a doctrinal test. And if I give him a doctrinal test, if I discuss anything, it's the gospel. Why? Because he says that's what they discussed in chapter 1, and that's what he discussed in chapter 2.
As we've already established, the gospel, discussed in chapter 1 and 2, is about Gentiles being saved without following Jewish laws. Nothing about resurrection. You are illicitly bringing this in from other passages, contrary to basic hermeneutical best practices for scripture interpretation among evangelicals.
So I'm not saying Bart is wrong. Overall, that's what he was doing. He wanted to be approved. But to be approved means to pass the test on the gospel. Now, I know Bart doesn't think, I know when Bart says it, he says, Jesus didn't call himself God. Yeah, nothing against Bart. I just think you have to get the whole message. Resurrection's got, if you talk about the gospel, resurrection's got to be there, period.
Now that you've answered this question, Gary, maybe you can at least stop saying that Bart agrees with you on this.
Bart Ehrman has come out and said, no, Gary totally misquoted me, he got me wrong. I never said that.
Or is that too much to ask? To recap what happened here, Gary admitted that Bart's interpretation of Galatians is correct, and indeed, the vast majority interpretation. I guess at least 90% of those who have written Galatians commentaries, but you'll just have to take my word for it. Since vibes are apparently good enough to declare consensus, Gary tacitly admitted that Galatians' support for his resurrection case requires going outside the passage when the immediate context is already clear. And he's admitted that his hypothetical scenario about doctrinal tests is his own fan fiction scenario without supporting evidence.
I see this as an absolute win.
Now, twice, Dale asks about the ethics of this situation.
In terms of your volume 3 and your methodology, what sort of steps did you take to ensure that you are actually accurately quoting the scholars that you're putting in your in the volume?
Sure.
No answer.
Okay, but I am curious in your answer on the more general, volume 3 methodological thing. Like when you're quoting these scholars, the incident with Bart is just a case in point. Like, what steps did you take to ensure you're quoting them accurately? And did you try to make sure that you're quoting their current positions versus older positions? Like, what steps did you give to be accurate when you represented these scholars?
Again, a long response with no answer. So Dale tried to give him an answer.
So I think you would kind of say, based on that sort of case study in general, when you're quoting scholars throughout volume 3, you would look at their multiple sources and cross-check, make sure, am I representing these guys right? I'm not just taking one quote out of context or something in full context.
And I want to be, you can say, well, you used 3 of his books. No, I use a number of Bart sources, but I did spend more time on those 3: Apocalyptic Prophet, Did Jesus Live, and his, what I call the Red Book, on how the Galilean preacher became the Son of God.
Strike 3. That is not an answer to how Gary ensures he's quoting scholars accurately. Just a defensive trip down memory lane about the colors of Bart Ehrman's book covers. Understandably, Dale decided to give up on this line of inquiry, so we'll never know what steps, if any, Gary uses to ensure he's accurately quoting people.
I'm also today not emphasizing a different layer of criticism, which is real concerns about Dr. Habermas's ability to interpret accurately the scholars that he summarizes and lists and tells you, what supposedly this scholar thinks. There are real serious problems with that, but today I'm not going to be emphasizing that. Today, I'm going to be talking about a different layer. So there's a lot of layers of problems with this.
Mysterious ways.
All right. Well, all right. At this point, I have been a bad host, so I will wrap up because I know Gary's got to go somewhere. But yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. Like I said, these objections raised by various skeptics. Again, we didn't mention anyone's name on purpose, but there were fans of mine, both Christian and non-Christians, who at least I think are sincere in wanting these answers. So that's why I felt it was really important to get your take. from the primary source out there. So
I will say, since it seems to be a decade or two since Gary had a public conversation with a skeptic, I'm grateful to his friends, Mike Lacona and Real Seeker Dale, for at least attempting to get honest answers out of him for those of us who have sincere concerns and questions. Thanks, Dale.
if somebody miscommunicates or says something wrong, let's look beyond what are they intending to say. And on that front, I think that'll improve our dialogue between the two sides. So
let me just put on the record, lest it not be clear, I'd very much love to have a friendly conversation with Dr. Habermas. Anytime.
All right, man. Well, you did a super job. Thanks for the interview.
No problem. Thank you, Gary. And take care, everybody.